Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being at the East-West Center in Washington on this rainy, slightly cool fall day. Delighted to have you here. My name is Satu LeMay. I'm the director here, and I think we just have a fabulous program this afternoon over lunch with our former visiting fellow and now at American University, Dr. Vivanshu Shekhar, who specializes on Indonesia, has spent a lot of time out there and is in fact visiting faculty at Paramadina University. And then we're very honored and pleased to be also able to have Pak Arto Suryo Dipro here from the Indonesian Embassy. He's the DCM, Deputy Chief of Mission.
The honor is all mine.
We're delighted. The East-West Center really is grateful for your presence. I met Arto some time ago, and we struck up a conversation which I found to be one of the more interesting conversations I've had here on Indonesia, and it's led to a lot of my thinking about how we might move ahead in talking about U.S.-Indonesia relations. And the timing is perfect for this program because, as you all know, in about 3 weeks' time, the President of Indonesia will be visiting Washington and another place in the United States, possibly, which follows on a series of high-level profile visits from across the region. Obviously, Prime Minister Abe, President Xi, Prime Minister Modi, and then we'll have President Jokowi, and then, of course, President Park from Korea as well. So this is kind of the context and kind of gives you a scope, and I thought what we'd do is Vivanshu has a PowerPoint that he'd like to share and discuss for about 30, 40 minutes. And then I've invited Pak Arto to go ahead and speak for about 20 minutes. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. Now, just ground rules so everybody understands the ground rules. Today's program everyone has agreed that it's on the record, and it is being podcast for folks who couldn't join us. And just know that. So as we get to Q&A as well, that you know that you're on the record and being filmed. So with that, you have their bios. They're distinguished in their own ways, and you can look at the details. But let's move ahead with the program. Vivanshu, why don't you take it away, and then we'll turn to Pak Arto.
Thank you, Satu. And let me thank East-West Center for giving me this opportunity to speak on such an important topic. And thank you, Pak Arto, for joining us. It seems like everything that I knew about Indonesia 5 or 6 years ago, or Indonesian foreign policy, is an ancient history. So much has changed. And these changes are not taking place just in terms of regular policy pronouncements and policy initiatives, but they are much more fundamental, and these shifts are occurring even at the level of strategic thinking of Indonesia. I was finishing writing a manuscript in January 2014. And this is the book that came out the end of 2014, early 2015. In July 2014, when I visited Indonesia, I was trying to see how the electoral politics was taking shape. I realized that so much has changed that I need to write another book on Indonesian foreign policy. ASEAN Studies Initiative at American University was kind enough to entertain this idea, and currently it's been more than a year, and I'm working on another one. The difference is that this one is a more global outlook of Indonesian foreign policy. The ongoing project is more on Indonesia's regional foreign policy outlook. So how does one bring out all those major structural shifts as well as policy shifts which are taking place in Indonesia? What I've done is I've tried to bring out a two-tier analytical framework that would discuss structural shifts. These structural shifts are essentially in terms of changes in strategic thinking. They transcend government. They are much more regional, and they're also going to influence Indonesian foreign policy in a longer term fashion. On the other hand, I have tried to also discuss issue-specific debates and relate how these structural shifts are shaping these issue-specific debates. So when we talk about today, like Indonesian foreign policy has changed considerably, it's actually a result of both the processes. It's not temporary. It's a much more long-term. Once I do that, then I'll discuss briefly challenges also that the current presidency of Joko Widodo, popularly known as Jokowi, faces. Essentially, two types of changes, domestic and external. Let me put this. So this is what I'm trying to talk about. So the structural reset, if we look at just the points which are there, one can easily see how the left side of sentences are shaping the right side of issues. What I've called, one is the structural reset, the other is the Jokowi reset. Had it been someone like, say, President Megawati Sukarnoputri or President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, these changes may not have been so prominent or so pronounced. But President Jokowi introduced a very different style of policy, foreign policy, and also different set of priorities when he launched his own Poros Maritim Dunia or Global Maritime Fulcrum. It redefined the whole political discourse. And it was not just a foreign policy discourse, it started as an electoral discourse. So what he was bringing out was so different from what was being talked about before the 2014 elections. And what he was bringing out was essentially a result of what I would say is a maturation of these structural debates which were taking place earlier. If you look at like Southeast, for example, Indonesia's changing canvas, Southeast Asia to Indo-Pacific Asia. It didn't happen in 2014, or it didn't happen after 2014. We heard Pamati Natalegawa talking about it in the U.S. in May 2013. Then it was again talked about the SBA government in 2014. And then the final major shift came during the election manifesto when the Jokowi Yusuf Kala Visi Misi identified Indo-Pacific as one of the concentric circles that they will try to focus on. Let me to discuss or to put the structural reset in a proper policy framework, let me highlight some of these issues, some of these key relevant points. So this is Indonesia. Everyone knows, the Indonesia is being seen as an emerging power, as a global swing state, as third largest democracy, as fifth largest economy in Asia, etc., etc. But as the capacity and the overall strength and wealth of Indonesia has grown, it has also introduced a distinct desire to play a different role. And this desire to play, or this growing ambition, has created a kind of dilemma for Indonesia, and it has been there it has been there for the last 5-6 years. It has informed the Indonesian strategic thinking that whatever the earlier methods and strategies were there, they are no longer effective in addressing the rapid changes that are taking place in the Indo-Pacific region. It also made Indonesian leadership or political elite to realize that Indonesia as an emerging power has not been able to give its best to the region and to the world. But that's not a new discourse as well. The idea or the issue of punching below the weight, what they call, didn't start in 2009 when first time Dr. Rizal Sukma brought it into the open. It started actually early 90s. In early 90s, Indonesia was growing again. Indonesia was a part of the Asian tiger economies. Indonesia was much more confident. I'm talking about 95, not about 98, 97. So this is just before the crisis. And there was a thinking, and one of the senior journalists wrote that CSIS, some people in CSIS Jakarta used to think that Indonesia is a major power, if not major, at least a middle power, and it should play its role accordingly. Which means that sense of dissonance between its status and its delivery was very much realized or very much discussed then as well. After 2009, of course, this punching below the weight has become much more not just national but also a regional discourse. 3 years ago, Australia's former foreign minister, Gary Evans, wrote that now Indonesia was punching as per its weight. A senior journalist wrote this year that Indonesia is now punching above its weight. So all these, this shows a very different set of narrative that's. There's another shift also which is taking place in terms of Indonesia's emerging power dilemma. That is, what is the best canvas to project Indonesia's regional diplomacy or foreign policy? And this dilemma is more apparent in terms of whether to pick or whether to continue and go ahead focusing on ASEAN or Southeast Asia, or trying to figure out something bigger and something that is much more trendy and that's much more current. And so the Indo-Pacific debate that is happening, that has started 4 or 5 years ago, 3-4 years ago, that's provided the easy reading material or policy material to follow. And that also set up that. So the Indo-Pacific provided a bigger canvas, provided a kind of parity with other rising powers of Asia, China, India, Japan, and in the same league. So it kind of fit into what emerging Indonesia was looking for. And that's why and also I'll come on to that, the historical part of it later. So that provided an easy platform for Indonesia to pick up and sell it. And that's why we see that the 2014 electoral debates in Indo-Pacific came into that. Because it was responding, the other side, the Jokowi side, was trying to bring out something that was equally profound and that was equally comprehensive. Dr. Rizal Sukma wrote an Asian fulcrum of 4 in the Jakarta Post, I think in July 2015, this year. And he identified how Indonesia, India, China, and Japan, they should all work together and bring out or shape the regional order. The thing was with this that he talked about, that also shows a kind of dilemma within Indonesia, is he said that Indonesia is a middle power. And Indonesia should play the role of middle power and shape the architecture. The problem is the other 3 are not middle powers. Or at least they don't think of themselves as middle powers, like China, India, and Japan. So how does Indonesia want to interact with the big guys? Do they want to interact as a middle power, as a somewhat not of that scale, or it should interact as an emerging power, as an emerging great power? And this dilemma, this contradiction is still there. They talk about emerging power. At the same time, they will introduce middle power approach. And this has been going at least for the last 2-3 years. Okay, I have talked about Indo-Pacific thing. The only point that I would add here is the historical worldview that I didn't discuss earlier, that when they were discussing Indo-Pacific, it provided a perfect historical tradition in the sense that both Indonesia's foreign policy architects, Muhammad Hatta and President Sukarno, they both talked about what is known as two ocean, two continent worldview. The two oceans being Indian and Pacific, and two continents being Asia and Australia. So in a way, if we look at this one, Indo-Pacific is actually a much old discourse. What is happening now is actually a resurgence of the same discourse. And Indonesia, in a way, is a driver of, is a pioneer of that discourse. Another important change, which is again very fundamental, that has happened is in terms of Indonesia redefining what it's called concentric circles. A traditional way of looking at Indonesian foreign policy is to look at in terms of concentric circles. One is very archipelagic, that's immediate. Then there is an ASEAN in East Asia, and the third is the global. While the archipelagic one has remained more or less the same, it's the second circle that has seen changes. From earlier it used to be Southeast Asia, then it changed to East Asia, then it changed to East Asia Summit, then now it's changed to Indo-Pacific. East Asia Summit is essentially another reflection of Indo-Pacific debate discourse because it brings in India and Indian Ocean into that discourse. So these are this is again another fundamental change taking place in terms of the way Indonesia is thinking its strategic choices and priorities. Normative Indonesia's pragmatic turn. One could just see the difference between former President SBI's speech. He talked about Indonesia as a norm setter, consensus builder, peacekeeper, bridge builder. None of these one can see in President Jokowi's any of those speeches. It's just only one point probably is there is a voice of the developing world that was very prominent in President Jokowi's when he organized conference Asia Africa, right? Yeah, Afro-Asian conference in Bandung this year in April. So this Jokowi reset is basically focusing more instead of norms, instead of consensus, traditions, is focusing on interests. He's a businessman. That's what he prefers to do, and that's where he seeks more opportunities. And of course, development, integration, economics, they are key agendas. And resources, protection of resources have prompted the current leadership to introduce hard power and power politics into the game. And of course, President Jokowi's current leadership is not willing to take up that ASEAN responsibility so much. I'll discuss that later. I just wanted to highlight it here. This is again, underbalancing is something it's understood as any state's deliberate negligence towards building defense capabilities. That's called as underbalancing. It fits perfectly in Indonesia's case. So the last 30 years, Indonesian Navy is much worse, as it's actually not as good as even smaller Southeast Asian navies. Despite the fact that Indonesia is the largest archipelago in the world, it has to manage 17,000 islands, critical straits and strategic choke points, and maritime corridors. So that has led to a very distinct set of thinking now. That's internal balancing. Now they're focusing more on building defense capability to reflect that Indonesia is an emerging power. And 30 years, someone actually wrote that it seems that underbalancing is becoming Indonesia's strategic culture. So if we look at it in that sense, then it's also a structural reset or a reset in terms of Indonesia's fundamental strategic choices. And of course, Indonesia as a maritime power, this discourse is also, one could say, that 5 or 6 years old. And former President SBA pushed forth this idea of recentering Indonesia's maritime identity, but didn't go much far on this concept. It was the Jokowi presidency that brought it into the limelight, into the center of not only Indonesia's foreign policy discourse, but also the center of regional Indo-Pacific discourse. And both being Indian Ocean and Pacific being a maritime entity, this maritime discourse connected with the Indo-Pacific discourse. So we could also see a interconnectivity among these different components of strategic thinking that the emerging Indonesia is currently debating about. Now, I'll come to issue-specific debates. Now, since I have already laid out some of the basic structural reset, Indonesia is an Indo-Pacific power, Indonesia is a maritime power, Indonesia is an emerging power, Indonesia is a pragmatic power, Indonesia as a power that is focusing on building power or building capabilities, defense capabilities. Now, let's see how all of those elements are figuring into these new these specific issues. Okay, now this is how the last 15 years, how the President Jokowi's foreign policy been discussed and debated. Initially, it was called being assertive. It was also called internationalist. Slowly and gradually, it became the international, the academic debate on it started shifting towards projecting Indonesian foreign policy as inward-looking, narrow nationalist, shrinking, autopiloted, and someone even said whether it's not clear whether Indonesian foreign policy has any direction right now. And in fact, if we look at it, these are essentially different facets of the same, of the larger comprehensive picture of Jokowi's foreign policy. Of course, it's internationalist in the sense that it has focused on East Asia Summit, APEC, Afro-Asian Conference, and, of course, Voice of the Developing World. So that provides a very wider international global outlook. It's definitely assertive. President Jokowi mentioned, actually, during the Afro-Asian Conference that the U.S.-led world order is obsolete now. And that gives a kind of drastic statement that the picture that how assertive he was trying to be. It may be just more a matter of style. He just wanted to be more just wanted to be more visible, probably. But that also says, his approach. And, of course, we saw there was a lot of writings on the issue of execution when people said that he was trying to be assertive to avoid his lack of decision-making power inside the government. So what he was missing inside the government, he was trying to gain through the international venue. So that's also one of them. And, of course, sinking the ship, that has become an international issue, and it has also showed that how Indonesian foreign policy is acquiring an assertive outlook. Inward-looking, which is also true in a sense that the government has focused more on maritime development, maritime connectivity, bringing in investment, focus on resource nationalism in terms of, not so much, in terms of giving what they call fair share to Indonesian domestic industries into international, whenever they enter into international collaboration, or whenever there's a foreign investment coming into Indonesia. And this is more pronounced in terms of resource sector, oil and gas, mining, and etc. It also suggests some contradiction. I mean, how can an assertive and internationalist foreign policy be shrinking and inward-looking? So, and this is happening the same 1 year. So it just makes, if it's post-ASEAN, which means it's going beyond ASEAN, which is a much wider and broader canvas, then may not be narrow, it may not be inward-looking, which means certainly it's trying to go bigger. There are other elements that may be considered as inward-looking, but the canvas is certainly much wider and much broader. So on this, I would just say it's basically the main facets of the same truth. As an emerging Indonesia tries to deal with a very complex regional setting, it has to have its own complex set of policies in place. The new maritime vision. As we were talking about these changes in strategic thinking or structural reset, I thought that I will mention in the beginning how different elements of structural reset is shaping Indonesia's new maritime vision. Though it started as an electoral discourse, Indonesia was essentially responding to a very powerful regional debate. And that debate is not just, it's both integrative debate, it's also a debate focused on hostility and rivalry. And this rivalry is not just between great power rivalry, but also a rivalry in terms of different maritime space, say, for example, in South China Sea, but also in the Indian Ocean. So and in terms of integration, we have seen that the region, well, of course, the integration of this Indian and Pacific itself is an expression of this integrative debate. But beyond that, there's also China's Maritime Silk Road Initiative. India also probably came up with its own, what they call the MOSIM initiative, which they were trying to go towards the Indian Ocean and connecting the old idea of monsoon. Now, major thrust of this maritime vision has been on interconnecting thousands of islands. The government has decided to come up with different ports. This is not my map. I just picked up from the Google. So these are 24 different ports that they are trying to, that they have decided to build on. And I thought that this will be good to put it there. And as we can see, the large number of these these initiatives are on the outer islands and in Sumatra, and also towards this part. This is where this Natuna thing is there, right? Okay, so that's something very interesting. So what has happened is, it's along with these number of ports, they're also trying to have probably around 800 ships. 200 they're trying to build on their own, and probably more they will import from outside. It seems that China is probably is a major partner in port ship procurement. It seems like. And there is also a good deal of interest in investing in the modernization of ports. And that actually is one important point that I thought that I should bring out, is while Indonesia is engaging with China on infrastructure and port building, Indonesia intends to engage with the U.S. on port management. And that shows how Indonesia is trying to have a very nuanced diplomacy with major powers that I'll try to highlight more in detail later. Indonesia's South China Sea strategy. There has been the last 2 years, and there has been a lot of talk on how much shift has taken place in Indonesia's strategic thinking. I try to take a contrarian view on this. I think Indonesian position on the dispute has remained the same, but Indonesian position on diplomacy has shifted drastically. And it seems that in terms of the dispute, what they're trying to do is essentially look for a correct semantics. So the reason why I'm asking is, someone said the beginning of this year in one of the conferences in CSIS Jakarta that Indonesia is the sixth claimant state in the South China Sea issue. I mean, that's pretty catchy to say. But beyond sensationalism, there's also a reality that Indonesia has to contend with, is that no matter what it does, it cannot claim that it is a party to the dispute, because it's something that is not within Indonesian realm. It's China's 9-dash line. So China has to decide, and that there is no dash line. This is the State Department's map that shows 1947. I think probably Kuomintang government's 11-dash line, and the red one is the current China's dash line. And of course, there's no dash line there next to Pulau Natuna Besar, which is Natuna Archipelago. So, and the Chinese government hasn't given any Indonesian government asked for whether there has been any clarification if you could give on this issue, and the Chinese government hasn't. So Indonesia has officially rejected and questioned its legitimacy even before the UN. So even if Indonesia wants to, legally it's impossible for Indonesia to claim something that doesn't exist or it doesn't recognize. So one could put it as Indonesia is engaged in a dispute, or Indonesia is engaged in a claim over a line that it doesn't recognize. So my struggle has always been with how to get the accurate semantics on this, and probably this is where the real issue with the South China Sea, in terms of Indonesia's position on that, lies. But definitely there is a degree of wariness over how, in the future, the Chinese government would respond to this dispute. Anyway, it's just sea. There is no island that is under contestation. It's a part of the EEZ. So but there definitely there's a degree of wariness, and that wariness, along with the other set of wariness over resources, they have come up with a strategy of what I call maritime fencing. And before I get into, I'll explain maritime fencing in the next slide, but I thought that I'll just mention briefly that it has shifted from what earlier was a 2D. 2D means dialogue and diplomacy. If you look at Indonesia's South China Sea position, it was earlier in 90s, or even most of 2000 was the dialogue and diplomacy. Around 2000, even up until actually early 2014, things seems to have changed. In 2014, at the end of 2014, I thought it was turning towards 4Ds, which means dialogue, diplomacy, defense development, and deployment. Today, it seems that there is just two, and that's the defense development and deployment. And that's why, so the point what I was trying to make is that the position on diplomacy has shifted drastically. It doesn't want to get involved into the messiness of South China Sea dispute. And of course, it's also concerned about ASEAN's own divided position, because of one time in 2012, it did engage in a shuttle diplomacy to make sure that ASEAN retains a united position, but probably it's no longer interested. The Jokowi presidency is no longer interested in undertaking the same kind of endeavor again. And of course, I think the reason is that they don't want to upset the Chinese apple cart, not because there is a very strong bond, but because it's interest driven. There's been a lot of talk whether Indonesia's China policy is threat driven or balance of power. I think it's in terms of interest. The current presidency at least looks at it in terms of interest. It has a strong, it looks at China as a new opportunity. Large scale of infrastructure development funding coming with the Silk Road initiative, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So it looks at China as an opportunity. It doesn't want to disturb whatever it has got going for itself. Oh yeah, okay. This is another important thing that I thought that I'll highlight: Indian Ocean being a part of the Indo-Pacific debate. In the State of the Nation address of President Jokowi, that was his first State of the Nation address, he didn't mention ASEAN, but he mentioned Indian Ocean. And Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi's visit to the U.S., she spoke at two places, at the U.S.-Indo Gala dinner and also at the Wilson Center. And in both the places, she outlined in detail as to what Indonesia's Indian Ocean policy is going to be. As you can mention, that there are different catalysts, and these catalysts have driven Indonesia to have a much better look. Indonesia was not looking at Indian Ocean earlier. It was considered as a blind spot in Indonesia's foreign policy. Now it seems that this blind spot is getting some light. And of course, Indonesia is an IORA chair. And the thrust of Indonesian initiative as a chair will be, this is what I was told, will be on building an order that doesn't exist, or that hardly exists in the Indian Ocean. And given Indonesia's role as an architecture builder in the Pacific part of it, it does sound a bit convincing. And of course, the Indonesian is trying to give more visibility to the Indian Ocean Rim Association. This is, I was thinking it's my punchline, but probably not. ASEAN is not Jokowi's Indonesia's cornerstone. It was said this year that ASEAN is not the cornerstone, but a cornerstone. But it seems that ASEAN is no cornerstone. And the reason I'm saying, the reason I'm saying is that during the State of the Nation, as I mentioned, that President Jokowi didn't mention ASEAN at all, and at least it could have got one line or one mention. He mentioned Middle East, mentioned Palestine. He didn't mention ASEAN. Minister Marsudi, when she was talking at the U.S.-Indo Gala dinner, and I think I shared this with Arto, that she didn't mention ASEAN either, and she also mentioned Indian Ocean. So certainly, a cornerstone not being mentioned in a major foreign policy speech, it means that there is no cornerstone. And also, annual press a statement that comes out every year in January. This year that came out didn't mention ASEAN as a thrust area. Emerging Indonesia's great power game. This is also reflective of both structural reset as well as the issue-specific debate. Structural reset in the sense that earlier, since 50s, Indonesia had a foreign policy based on rowing between two reefs, Mandayung Antara Dua Karang. Now it seems to have changed to Mandayung Antara Karang Karang, or Mandayung Antara Banyak Karang. That's so. Also, when I've talked to people in Jakarta, no one has had a positive feedback on this idea of million friends, zero enemies. They all say, what is this? It just doesn't make sense. There are not million countries. How? But it also but I like this thing in the sense that it actually places Indonesia's priorities in a better perspective. In the sense that if we look at Indonesia's engagement with major powers, it seeks robust engagement with all the major powers. And in that sense, this idea of not having any kind of disconnect with any major power, a million friends, does make some sense. So when I talk about today as Indonesia's multi-alignment or multifocal hedging strategy, it actually goes back to former President SBI's million friends, zero enemies, or Pamati's dynamic equilibrium. Indonesia has, of course, signed a strategic partnership with all the major regional major powers, with India in 2005, with China in 2005, with Japan in 2006, with the U.S. in 2010. So that's also placing the relationship on the even keel. What differentiates each of these partnerships is the capacity or the resources that the two partners can bring together onto the cooperation and agenda. I'll just touch on this Sino-Japanese and let me this visit. So this gives a good idea as to how Indonesian Jokowi presidency has tried to manage these triangular great game. President Jokowi visited Japan. That was his first visit, and the statement that he gave, China's 9-9 has no international basis, it created a lot of excitement or interest both outside. But it also created some kind of nervousness within Kamlu in Indonesia as to why he did that. But and also signed an MOU on enhancing the defense cooperation. I'm not sure as to what is the current status of MOU, because MOU has to go through the parliament, and there the problem lies. So the best way to get cooperation going with Indonesia is not to sign an MOU, rather sign an agreement. So the China, of course, visited twice, and there's both the Chinese side and the Indonesian side have shown that there's a greater degree of convergence in terms of infrastructure development and connectivity program. And actually, the idea of Maritime Silk Route was first proposed in 2013 October when President Xi Jinping was visiting Indonesia. So, and with the this also shows that while Indonesia is focusing on maritime connectivity, economy, development, and integration with China, it's focusing on maritime security with the U.S. So that also shows a very eclectic kind of foreign policy approach. Do I have 2 minutes? Okay, that's it. Okay, these are so just briefly touch upon challenges. Both are domestic and external. Any developing society any day has 1,000 challenges to deal with in terms of bureaucracy, politics, regular policy dealings, and of course issue of corruption. And economic slowdown has definitely pulled down the morale of the Jokowi government in a big way. He was hoping that it will be 7%. It has gone down to 5%, 4 point something. So that is, of course, the external situation is not very good. China's slowdown has, of course, had ripple effects on Indonesian economy. But my take is that it might actually be a good factor for Indonesia in the sense that there's already a glut of raw materials in China in terms of cement and other construction materials that could be used by Indonesia in terms of connectivity and infrastructure development program as a part of global maritime fulcrum. And Indonesia is, of course, worried about great power rivalry, how that might shape Indonesia's interests, or that might upset Indonesia's interest. Pa Marty Natalegawa talked about long ago a peace dividend that helped Indonesia gain an emerging power status. But if that peace dividend is disrupted, then Indonesia's long-term interests might be at stake. And it's also worried about the South China Sea issue and regional architecture not going much far. So concluding remarks, though I have listed a lot of sentences, and let me please read this out. Indonesia's foreign policy shifts is a result of a structural reset, as I mentioned earlier. And the Jokowi reset has actually made these changes much more pronounced. And I think it's a course correction. For an emerging power, this is where they will be, because if you look at all other emerging powers, they're all going beyond their traditional geopolitical sphere. India is going beyond South Asia, China is going beyond East Asia, Indonesia will also go beyond Southeast Asia. So that is, I would say, is inevitable. And of course, it's going to have a much larger implications in beyond 2019. These are trends that are going to stay there. They're not going to, and they're going to shape Indonesian foreign policy, irrespective of change in the leadership. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vivanshu. There's a lot there to come back to, but first I want to give a chance to Pak Arto to lay out his case and any responses he wished to make to your presentation, and then give us time to discuss and have questions and answers. Yeah. She's just taking notes. Thank you, Pak Arto, please.
Thank you very much, Satu. Thank you, Vivanshu, for your presentation. Very, very interesting and enlightening one indeed. I'd like to begin by thanking East West Center for having me here. I'd also like to thank everybody for making it here. I'm approaching the issue obviously from a very different perspective. I'm I work in the foreign ministry, so obviously from a very bureaucratic perspective, you'll hear a lot about process, and you will not hear me using terms like punching. We will not be punching anybody. And I'd like to organize my thoughts along the idea of change and continuity. And talking about change, to my mind, Indonesia's foreign policy is changing, but not in a such a drastic way. It's more of an evolutionary change. It's in a way of some priorities are becoming more pronounced. These are changes that the basis may take place over the years, but now the new government is setting certain policies as priorities, so they will resources would be allocated to them, and the new policy is framed under what began as Jokowi Dodo's election campaign as the 9 policies, or Nawacita, and then under it there was on foreign policy or foreign policy related policies. They would be to promote Indonesia's identity as an archipelagic state. This would include maritime diplomacy, maritime sovereignty, securing maritime resources and the exclusive economic zone, and to manage maritime rivalry among the great powers, and to resolve territorial disputes. The second one is to promote Indonesia as a regional player with selective global interest. So under it, you will see protection of Indonesians overseas, Indonesian nationals, and Indonesian entities overseas. You will see that the Foreign Minister, Retno Marsudi, has been very active, very pronounced on this. Multilateralism at the global level, to strengthen Indonesia's role as a democratic country and a country with the largest Muslim population, how to promote moderate Islam, strengthen cooperation in the G20, resolving global issues, helping to resolve global issues, South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, conflict resolution, peacekeeping, peace building, and then the third one is on promoting Indonesia's role in the Pacific and Indian Oceans region, so connecting a region that covers the 2 oceans. And this is about strengthening leadership of Indonesia in ASEAN and strengthening cooperation and ensuring ASEAN centrality, strengthen regional architecture, in particular under the East Asia Summit, strengthen and develop strategic bilateral partnerships, and to manage regional economic integration. And finally, to promote comprehensive maritime cooperation, in particular in the Indian Ocean. These are the stated policies. You can have them, they are available on the internet, but I thought it's important to go through each and every one of them. Again, because I'm a bureaucrat, I have to do that.
Yeah, of course.
But how this has manifested in the East Asia Summit, for example, Indonesia has been promoting an East Asia Summit statement on enhancing regional maritime cooperation. When you have a discourse at regional organizations, it could be ARF, it could be East Asia Summit, it could be APEC. Different fora would have a very different nuances about maritime issues. In ARF, for example, or East Asia Summit, the talk of maritime issues could could generate very different kinds of reactions. Different, for example, from APEC. So when we were chairing APEC in 2013, we promoted the idea of maritime cooperation, because where would be a better place to talk about cooperation, maritime cooperation, than APEC? There is no. These are economies. These are not officially not states. It is about cooperation. So we try to promote the sense of cooperation through APEC. The idea is that it would support any dialogue about maritime issues in other fora, ARF, for example, or the East Asia Summit. And it could act as another layer of diplomacy in the region. Because diplomacy is about layers of bilateral. There's a bilateral layer. There's the trilateral or quadruple layers. There's the sub-regional. There are regionals. There's the international. So it's about strengthening the various layers of diplomacy. And another thing about the change of the Jokowi government is the strong focus on economic issues. Vibanshu talked a lot about this, about the dividends from various bilateral cooperation. When President Joko Widodo undertakes a foreign visit, the economic agenda is very much the focus of his visits. In particular, when it comes to the tangible results for Indonesia, and it has to be very concrete, not in terms of ideas, but what is it that Indonesia can gain. So that's the, in a nutshell, the change that the new government has been promoting. It's a change in priorities and also a change in the practical outcomes that is expected from various policies and activities. Coming to continuity, one factor that obviously would always be there is geography. It's a fact of life. Indonesia is an archipelago, and it lies between two oceans and two continents. And I was reminded, every school kid in Indonesia is taught that. When I was a boy, I was taught Indonesia lies between two oceans and two continents. We grew up with it. It has shaped the Indonesian culture as a very open society of an archipelago. We absorb everything, basically. Now, about the question, is ASEAN the cornerstone, a cornerstone, or not a cornerstone? Let me put it in the context that Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, is a very open and strategic region. We know in the past, what could happen if this region was not united under one framework. So there are those lessons from the past, and we want to move forward. That's why ASEAN was strengthened. 15 years ago, all countries came under the ASEAN umbrella. We worked towards the ASEAN community. And it's a matter of how to continue to move this forward. It is a stated policy of the Jokowi government that ASEAN and ASEAN centrality would remain a priority. We will see how this will play out. But again, when it comes to allocation of resources, within the foreign ministry, the department that manages ASEAN issues, if it grows in size, then obviously it will have more capacity to deal with issues. In the past decade or so, in the search of way to have ASEAN to strengthen ASEAN integration, to strengthen the cohesiveness of the Southeast Asian countries, a number of concepts have been developed. Indonesia, for example, promoted the idea of maritime cooperation. In 2003, at the ASEAN Summit, Indonesia introduced the idea of developing ASEAN Maritime Forum. I know this very well because it originated from a paper I wrote that was published in the Indonesian Quarterly. But the forum itself was then established in 2010. And then it was used by Foreign Minister Natalegawa to use it as a platform for maritime cooperation. So it became, there was the ASEAN Maritime Forum and then the enhanced ASEAN Maritime Forum. It's an idea of having the ocean as a connecting factor rather than a dividing factor. It's also traditionally Indonesian concept of tanah air. The Indonesian archipelago is land and water as a unity. So it's an Indonesian concept that we project outwards. Another geographic factor that comes into play is the fact that Indonesia is large, but large in a sense that it has a complex neighborhood. Vibanshu talked about complex region, complex diplomacy. This is very much the case. Different parts of Indonesia would have different kinds of neighbors. In all, we have 10 neighbors. So the diplomacy in Southeast Asia would be very different from Indonesia's diplomacy in our Pacific neighborhood. Issues would be different. The concerns of our neighbors would be different. So we have developed, I guess, to use your term, a complex diplomacy. It's about we have Pacific neighborhood, we have the Southeast Asian neighborhood, we have the Indian Ocean neighborhood. Now it's a matter of there is consistency across the Indonesia's diplomacy across the board. One of them is about building norms and institutions. We want to create a peaceful and prosperous neighborhood across the board. We want to have an inclusive processes. So all countries should be part of any dialogue or institutions. We want to manage change, and usually with change, there will also be some form of tensions. We want to manage them through dialogue and diplomacy, and to build trust and confidence. So this it's an understanding we have on our Indian Ocean neighborhood, Southeast Asian neighborhood, our Pacific neighborhood. And we want to strengthen cooperation to manage not only the traditional challenges, but also new challenges in the region like climate change and environmental preservation. In the past 15 years, you will see that Indonesia engaged the Pacific Islands Forum. A few years ago, we became an observer in the Melanesian Spearhead Group, and now Indonesia is an associate member. And then with a number of Pacific countries, we established the Coral Triangle Initiative, also with the support of the US, Australia, and a number of other countries. And then with Indonesia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, Australia, New Zealand, we established the Southwest Pacific Dialogue. Now, all of these institutions, which Indonesia is very concerned about, these are priorities. Not necessarily all ASEAN countries would have the same concern. some countries may find these regions, the issues, too distant. So it would explain why some of these issues ASEAN are not involved. Just like in APEC, there are 7 ASEAN members forming what is called the ASEAN Caucus in APEC, but it's not a full-fledged ASEAN involvement. Very different from when it was in the 1990s. ASEAN was 6 members, all ASEAN were in APEC, but as ASEAN expanded to 10, and then the Asian financial crisis came into being, others chose not to join APEC, and there are only 7 ASEAN countries in APEC. I foresee that in the Indian Ocean also, as we take over the Indian Ocean Rim Association chairmanship, perhaps, the idea of an ASEAN caucus is there. I cannot prejudge how this will develop, just as I cannot prejudge if some Southeast Asian countries will join IORA or not, like, for example, Myanmar. At the moment, we have Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia inside the Indian Ocean Rim. So it comes to the question, so is ASEAN a cornerstone, the cornerstone, not a cornerstone? Well, it's a complex setting. But certainly ASEAN, when it comes to Southeast Asia, and this is a very strategic and a priority region, then obviously ASEAN is central to Indonesian foreign policy. And when we talked about lessons from the past, then we have to ensure that ASEAN remains a region that's united. There is we can take common position on issues of importance, especially when it comes to Southeast Asia. There are lessons from the ASEAN experience that we want to project outwards. The Foreign Minister Marsudi talked a lot about this in her speeches, both at the USINDO dinner and at Wilson. She talked about how the experiences we have in developing the Pacific Rim institutions, norm and institutions, the ASEAN Plus processes, the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, how all of those experience, how they may be useful to develop similar norms and institutions in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean Rim. We think it's possible. Work needs to be done. The minister talked about having an Indian Ocean Concord. I have not been informed what the Concord would consist of, but the idea is precisely to develop norms and institutions. Indonesia is driven. Vibanchu also indicated this. We are driven by our wish to participate in the maintenance of world order. This is a constitutional call. It's in the constitution, and we always refer to it that Indonesia will be part of the maintenance of world order. The manifestation of free and active foreign policy. It has been repackaged in many ways. During President Yudhoyono's government, it was packaged as navigating turbulent waters. So this is apart from the zero enemies and a million friends. Navigating turbulent waters. But it's the free and active foreign policy that is also driving us to, so for the president, apart from visiting China, also to visit the United States and to visit other parts of the world as well. It has been indicated that he will be coming end of October. He'll come to DC. There will be a number of agenda maritime cooperation would be high on the agenda. There's much that Indonesia and the U.S. can cooperate. Already, Indonesia and the United States are cooperating on developing an Indonesian Coast Guard. There will be cooperation discussions for strengthening defense cooperation, but defense more in the sense of developing the Indonesian defense industry. There will be talks about trade and investment. We are looking at concluding business deals. We'll see how that will materialize. Other priorities such as health and education. And also to review the structure and mechanism of bilateral cooperation with a view to strengthening it. So I think with that, I'd like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak. Thanks very much. I think we had, two in a way, very complementary presentations. One from a sort of working diplomat who's preparing for his president's arrival here and sort of fine-tuning the deliverables and the messaging. And so that was extraordinarily useful. And Vibanshu, I think, gave us a lot to think about on structural things. Opening up to discussion, but I want to just point out two things. This continuity versus change and structural versus issue frameworks are very interesting to me because, be very blunt because we don't have time. What was missing to me are a couple things that I just want to highlight. Both were very useful in framing the evolution of Indonesia's foreign policy. One is the material trends in Indonesia's foreign relations. And material trends, I mean everything from energy imports and exports to trade structure and composition of imports and trade, and all of those things that materially go into a foreign policy, where it might acquire technology for defense co-production, what have you. And it would be interesting to learn more about that element as it drives issues of issues and structure and continuity and change and relationships. The second was the democracy impact. I confess to you, I was surprised by how little democracy and the people's priorities in Indonesia came up in the discussion, because here you have this third largest democracy, this president who really comes from a kind of a different element of Indonesian elite. And what do the people expect of their foreign policy and their security policy? What is it? Do they want protection from outside competition? Do they want to be lifted out into development? What those? And the third was, what staggers me is whatever the continuity and change and structural and issue changes in Indonesia are, what is striking is the regional changes in which Indonesia now has to operate. China's rise, Japan's comparative, very relative weakening from its primacy as the leader of economic and development models in Asia. India burbling, the fact that Korea, becoming more active in the Look East policy, being more engaged in multilateral institutions, what have you. Korea moving from becoming an aid recipient to an aid provider. So a lot of changes in which the context in which Indonesia operates, and what is the give and take of that in shaping these continuity and change and structural and issues. So those are some comments. We have sufficient time for Q&A and discussion. Again, for those who may have come in late, just a reminder that we are on the record, and I would ask you simply to introduce yourself, identify your affiliation, and pose a comment or question to one or both of our speakers. So who'd like to kick it off? Tom, why don't we start? You do too. Okay, let me try to get everyone on the list. Let's start with Tom. Tom, please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group and the Malaysia-America Society. I wonder how the other major countries in ASEAN are reacting to these fundamental changes that both of you have been talking about. I'm thinking primarily of Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and the Philippines.
both of them?
Yes,
Please.
because Indonesia is not operating in a vacuum here, and to some extent, it has to reflect the interests of its neighbors.
Do you want to say more about that? But why don't you start?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the first things that a new leader or foreign minister, upon taking office, will do is visit the other ASEAN countries. So that's the more on the ceremonial side, introduction, tell you what I'm going to do aspect of it. And on the president's side, he's participated in a number of meetings other than his bilateral visits. He has meetings with the others. So I think what Indonesia intends to do, what are the priorities, these are well known. And in the ASEAN setting, the priorities are there about setting the community, issues on maritime cooperation. In terms of Indonesia's idea of strengthening maritime cooperation, it's supported by all the ASEAN members. In fact, I think all ASEAN members, all of them have oceans, but Laos. But even Laos is supportive of the maritime approach in ASEAN. So I think I'll stop there.
Panchu?
Okay, so my take is caution, concern, and waiting to see more. That is kind of ASEAN countries' response to it. And if we look at two issues, one is sink the ship strategy, and the issue of a refugee crisis in the Indian Ocean. On the refugee issues, actually Indonesia unilaterally took a lot more initiative, this is my take, than it did through ASEAN. And it was very active, and it did send whatever the resources it needed to do, it needed to provide. It did that. But somehow that lack of initiative was quite conspicuous when it came to pan-ASEAN response to that issue. On sinking the ship strategy, of course, so both in January and May, probably Indonesia burned some ships, and they belong to 3 ASEAN countries, Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And of course, it's a concern. Probably, I would assume that they will be a bit concerned about it, but it's also a kind of Indonesia's long-standing concern. In 2006 and 2007, then Defense Minister Juwono Sudarsono he wrote that Indonesian fishes are being taken away from its islands. And I was talking to one of two of the researchers, one in Balikpapan in Kalimantan, and another one in CSIS in Jakarta. And they said that suddenly after this strategy, suddenly there's a glut of fish in the market, which means that now the local people, they have more fishes, more sources of livelihood in terms of maritime. So a balance needs to be, probably one could argue that balance might be evolving or developing out of this, where both ASEAN countries and Indonesia would work towards it. That's yeah. Do I have to respond to your question too, or no? That was just comments.
Can we come back because
Yeah,
there's several
sure.
people on the
Okay,
line.
cool.
I want to get to them.
Yeah,
So I've
okay.
got 5 people on who want to make a comment or a question. Ellen, Professor Katada, our new visiting fellow, Professor Gupta, our new visiting fellow on economy, and Professor Yahuda as well, and then this young gentleman here. Ellen, why don't you start?
Yes,
and
thanks, Ellen Frost, East West Center. I want to pick up on Pak Arto's comment about maintenance of world order. We will shortly have a decision by the arbitration panel on jurisdiction in the case of China-Philippines dispute. Back in the late 1990s, I believe, Indonesia and Malaysia submitted a case, a territorial dispute, to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. But since then, we've had relatively little ICJ-related activity in the region. So there's, on the one hand, there's the ASEAN way, which is very consensus-minded and not legal. On the other hand, we have China's refusal to recognize jurisdiction and its preference for bilateral negotiations. It seems to me Indonesia, well, I guess it's a question really to both of you. What is Indonesia's position on introducing more arbitration, more law into some of the environment that you live in?
So why don't we take a couple and then ask you to think about them. Sorry?
Sorry for the second fellow here. Just I have a question regarding the notion of Indo-Pacific. I work on Japan, and from Japanese, now Abe, Prime Minister Abe is quite keen on that concept, and their position is this is a way to kind of push back or counterweight the China's dominance in the region. And I wonder if Indonesia has, what kind of take does Indonesia has on this kind of reconceptualization of the region with Indochina extending to oceans and so on. So that's one side of the question. And I also was struck by the presentation that you mentioned very little about Australia or United States. And especially Australia being very keen, again, on this Indo-Pacific notion. They actually published the defense white paper, I think 2013, I believe, mentioning that to be the kind of its major defense concept. So I would like you to comment on that.
Why don't we take these two, but be mindful of the time because we've got about 8 minutes and 4 more people on this. Okay.
Let me start with the last question, the Indo-Pacific one. My own take is that it's a very old concept. It goes back to Japan's own concept of broader Asia. It dates back to Indonesia's two ocean, two continent. And actually, in 1948, there was a meeting, there was a conference, and China was part of it. It was, of course, convened by the U.S., and Indonesia, India, Philippines, Singapore, they were all part of it, and the objective was to develop some kind of platform to deal with the maritime commons. Now, so out of it came out Indo-Pacific Fisheries Council. The interesting part is the name was later changed in 1973 to Asia-Pacific Fisheries Council, and later on in 91 it became Asia-Pacific Fisheries Commission within the UN. So the Indo-Pacific concept in that sense is much broader than Japan's own concept of trying to push back. To be fair enough, it's too big, and probably China is also a very powerful player. So my own take is it's an integrative discourse, and all other players will be there in that. On Australia, US, I was talking about the shift, and Australia, US are more a part of the continuity. So I didn't get into that, but if we have time, we could talk more on that later. Indonesia's position on law and environment, I would leave this to you, Pa.
Yeah, on this question, for us, UNCLOS sets out the rules for all kinds of maritime interaction. So everything should be, all countries should abide by the provisions of UNCLOS. Now, whether some countries, I do notice that how a country would see UNCLOS is also dynamic. A country would see UNCLOS as something that would, upon which it would base all of its policies, into something that it would be more selective on which to base its policies. But for us, UNCLOS should be the basis of everything, including on illegal fishing in Indonesian waters. Specifically on when talking about Japan and its pushback, we think it's important that we avoid all kinds of misunderstanding, miscalculations And this underlines the importance of regional institutions. Just to add into layers of diplomacy under which countries could have dialogue, could have discussions. And just on this, ultimately whether regional institutions are being used by countries would be up to these countries. What's important is that they are available, and so far what we see is that countries, they want to have those venues for dialogue. All countries support ASEAN centrality, so this is something that we continue to seek to strengthen. Australia is part of Indonesia's neighborhood in the Pacific. Obviously, it's a very unique relationship, Indonesia and Australia. I think it was a few years ago that we decided to have an annual leadership meeting. I have to inform myself how this is taking place this year. But relations with Australia is one of the most important relationships.
Thank you. Let me go to our next two, Professor Gupta and then Professor Yehuda. Maybe we'll take both of your questions and then...
Well, I'm sure Dr. Gupta, I'm an Asia fellow here at this call. My question actually follows up on Sathu's question about material trends and goes back to a comment you made earlier that how can an internationalist assertive foreign policy be inward-looking, and I kind of see some similarities with Indian foreign policy there. And I'm wondering if you would talk to, if you would speak to the role of trade in Indonesia's foreign policy vis-a-vis the democracy impact that Sadhu was also talking about.
Okay, Professor Yehuda.
I'm a visiting scholar at George Washington University. I'd like to ask a little bit more about relations with China. You spoke of Indonesia seeking to have relations of a special kind with Japan, China, and India, as notionally the four major powers. Now, of these, it seems to me that it's only China which challenges many of Indonesia's sort of self-defined interests. And that challenge seems to be growing. For example, for a long time, Indonesia seemed to overlook Chinese illegal fishing near Natuna Islands. More recently, that has not been the case. But on the other hand, given China's sort of superiority in naval capabilities, Indonesia, I suppose, having put a marker up, hasn't really been able to treat China as it did other transgressors. Meanwhile, there's a surge of seeking to cooperate with China. But this too seems to be very difficult on very crucial issues. I guess it's easy to talk about having investment in infrastructure, and China can come along and promise this and promise that. But when it comes to, say, the shift now to a more maritime interest, we've asked the Chinese to clarify their position on the 9-dash line. They haven't. Not just to you, but internationally. They haven't. Meanwhile, their leaders go around saying that there's really no dispute because all these islands and all our claims are indisputable. And they fit in with, they don't really base this on UNCLOS, although they do say it's in some sense or other fits in with UNCLOS, which again they don't explain how these things fit in. So, granted that you would like to have a good working relations with China, aren't you facing the problem of how to deal with a China whose, despite the rhetoric, its actual actions first of all, damage some of your fellow members of ASEAN, or at least that's how they see it. And secondly, doesn't really conform with this idea of Indonesia as a great emerging power. But on the contrary, it sees India in some sense or other as subordinate, or at least a secondary to China.
Thanks, Michael. So both of these, particularly trade may be oriented towards you, Pak, but both of you are welcome to two very interesting sets of questions.
Well, trade, particularly with the current government, has become, there's even greater emphasis on trade and on business deals and on how to utilize foreign investments and to direct it towards developing certain sectors that are of priorities in Indonesia. So, for example, there will be less emphasis on natural resources, but more emphasis on added value industries, creative economy, power generation, and infrastructure. Also some, for example, also priorities on connectivity. So, in terms of airplane sales, for example. So there's a greater interest for purchasing aircrafts or building maintenance facilities for aircrafts. So in these sectors of the economy. Turning to the question of China, well, the way we see it, China is not only that it's a re-emerging power. It has been part of the. Well, I think that's a bit of a cliche to say it's been part of the region. But throughout history, there are patterns of interaction in the region. But today, there are many facets of China. One of them is its maritime presence. That's one. There is no or very little direct negative interaction with Chinese entities in the oceans, and almost none when we speak of navy, maybe of some other maritime presence. So that's one part of it. The other part is we seek to also benefit from China's growth, and I think China also is seeking to do the same, because in a complex relationship, it's not only about hard power or navy vis-a-vis navy, but also in the more complex relationship. China understands very well that Indonesia continues to uphold its one China policy. It knows very well, for example, that even when diplomatic relations were frozen until 1991, we did not open diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So they understand that, and throughout. I'm speculating that in the thinking of Chinese policymakers also, the presence of the Indonesian archipelago figures very much in their thinking of the outside world.
You used to have a question, sir? No, we won't have time. I'm sorry. You're sure?
Both are important dilemmas that the current Indonesian foreign policy faces. In terms of trade and other those issues, technology issues, I was listening to a few months ago Indonesian petroleum minister, energy minister.
Energy,
yeah. And I asked him, I put this question to him, that how do you respond to the current problem that international investors are talking about in terms of the local content requirement, in terms of fair share. So he talked about a term called fair share, that you develop, you invest, we grow too, which somehow, so this is the overall objective, but to come to that requires a process, and there is probably difficulty in finding that process. So I would say that is where on the trade and technology issues. The second important dilemma is how to deal with such a wide asymmetry of capability and power between China and other ASEAN countries, including Indonesia too. And probably one of the drivers could be this asymmetry of capability that is driving, and given that there is no clarity about how the future intent might shape in case of China's claim on a part of the EEZ in the Natuna Archipelago. So as a result of that, the Indonesian government has launched what they call, I would say, is fencing strategy. What they're trying to do is they're trying to create a protected maritime space by maintaining vigilance, by maintaining surveillance, by engaging in domain awareness and all sorts of preventive deterrence program. And in fact, the development of the Coast Guard is also a part of that strategy to deter any future international illegal fishing. Indonesian Navy did sink a Chinese ship on that. That was also a kind of message to international legal fishers that this is what can happen, no matter how powerful you are. That's it.
Wonderful. Well, I know that Pak Arto